ancient China, dynasties, dragons, and the empire that changed the world. Asleep in class. Asleep in class. Welcome or welcome back to Asleep in Class, where we settle into long, quiet lectures about history, science, invention, civilization, and the strange paths of human knowledge. This episode follows ancient China through bronze ritual, early kingship, imperial ambition, frontier war, the memory of Mulan, the Great Wall, silk, paper, printing, gunpowder, dragons, dynasties, and the long life of an empire in human imagination. It is a calm journey through one of the world's deepest historical traditions. Not one single kingdom frozen in time, but a civilization shaped across many centuries by rulers, farmers, soldiers, scholars, artisans, families, mountains, walls, workshops, temples, laws, legends, and inventions. Some parts of this story belong to very early China. Some belong to later imperial China. Some belong to poetry, memory, and cultural identity rather than simple battlefield fact. But together, they help explain why ancient China remains one of the great historical worlds. A place where power could be ritual, where government could be written into law and measurement, where dragons could become symbols of imperial order, and where inventions born in workshops and courts could eventually travel far beyond the people who first made them. Before the empire, bronze, ancestors, and early kings. Long before China was ruled by emperors, long before the Great Wall became one of the most famous human-built structures on Earth, and long before paper, printing, gunpowder, or the compass altered the wider world, the lands that later formed China were already home to complex farming communities, fortified settlements, ritual centers, workshops, and ruling lineages. Ancient China did not begin all at once. It emerged slowly from many regions, many local cultures, and many generations of experiment in agriculture, craft, warfare, ritual, and authority. The Yellow River Valley was especially important in early Chinese history, but ancient China should not be imagined as only one riverbank or one narrow birthplace. Different regions contributed different crops, technologies, artistic styles, and political traditions. Millet farming was important in the north. Rice farming developed strongly in the south. Communities built houses, buried their dead with care, made pottery, worked jade, raised animals, defended settlements, and created ritual objects long before the first historically documented dynasties. Archaeology shows that early Chinese civilization was not a single straight road from village to empire. It was a wide landscape of regional cultures. Some communities made finely worked jade. Others developed elaborate pottery, rammed earth walls, social hierarchies, and ritual spaces. Some settlements became large enough to suggest organized labor and ranking. The later Chinese world inherited this older diversity. Its political center shifted over time, but its roots spread through many landscapes, many dialects, and many local traditions. By the second millennium BCE, the Shang dynasty had become one of the first Chinese dynasties that can be studied through both archaeology and writing. Earlier dynasties, especially the Xia, appear in later Chinese historical tradition, but the archaeological and textual evidence for them is more difficult and debated. The Shang, by contrast, left behind extraordinary material remains: royal tombs, walled centers, bronze vessels, weapons, workshops, and oracle bone inscriptions. These inscriptions are among the earliest known forms of Chinese writing. Oracle bones were usually animal bones or turtle shells used in divination. Questions were carved into them, heat was applied, cracks formed, and specialists interpreted those cracks as messages from ancestors or powers beyond ordinary human sight. The topics could be practical, royal, agricultural, military, or ritual. Would the harvest be good? Would childbirth go safely? Should the king hunt? Would enemies attack? Was a sacrifice acceptable? The bones show a world where kingship, warfare, ritual, family, and communication with the dead were tightly linked. Shang kings did not rule simply by issuing commands. Their authority was bound to ritual performance, ancestral connection, military power, and control over specialized craft production. Royal ancestors mattered because they were not imagined as gone in a modern private sense. They could be addressed, honored, consulted, and feared. The living ruler stood within a chain of power that included the dead, the court, the army, the calendar, the harvest, and the spirits. Bronze vessels were especially important. These were not simple cooking pots or decorative containers. Many were ritual objects used in ceremonies involving offerings of food and drink to ancestors. Their forms were powerful and formal: cauldrons, wine vessels, covered containers, and great handled pieces decorated with dense patterns, animal forms, and mask-like designs. To stand before one of these bronzes is to see a world where craft, ceremony, hierarchy, and memory are fused into metal. The casting of bronze required organization. Copper, tin, and lead had to be acquired. Fuel had to be gathered. Molds had to be prepared. Skilled workers had to understand heat, metal, clay, design, and timing. Bronze workshops were therefore not just artistic spaces. They were centers of elite power. A ruler who could command bronze production could display wealth, ritual legitimacy, and control over labor. The bronze vessel was an object of ceremony, but also an object of administration, hierarchy, and memory. Dragon-like forms appear in Chinese art and thought across long stretches of history, but they should not be flattened into one simple fantasy image. In Chinese tradition, dragons became associated with power, weather, water, cosmic order, fertility, and rulership. They were not the same as the fire-breathing dragons of many European legends. The Chinese dragon became a symbol that could gather many meanings: ruler, heaven, rain, auspicious strength, and the unseen forces connecting the human world to the natural and cosmic order. After the Shang came the Zhou. The Zhou dynasty began after the conquest of Shang power, traditionally dated to the 11th century BCE. Zhou rulers justified their rule through the idea later known as the mandate of heaven. This concept held that heaven supported a rightful ruler, but that a ruler could lose this support through cruelty, disorder, or failure. The mandate of heaven became one of the most influential political ideas in Chinese history. It helped explain dynastic change without presenting kingship as permanently fixed in one family forever. This was important because Chinese history would later often be remembered through dynastic cycles. A ruling house rises, brings order, becomes corrupt or weak, loses heaven's support, faces rebellion or invasion, and is replaced by a new house claiming renewed legitimacy. Real history was always more complicated than that pattern, but the pattern became a powerful way of interpreting political change. It also placed moral pressure on rulers. Power was not supposed to be merely possession. It had to be justified by order. The Zhou period lasted for centuries, but over time, Zhou royal authority weakened. Powerful regional states grew stronger. Aristocratic houses competed. Warfare expanded. Ritual order frayed. The later Zhou era included the spring and autumn period and the warring states period, when multiple states struggled for survival and dominance. It was an age of violence, diplomacy, reform, military innovation, and intellectual creativity. During these centuries, some of China's most influential philosophical traditions took shape. Confucius lived during the late spring and autumn period. He looked back toward older ideals of ritual, moral cultivation, family order, proper conduct, and humane government. Later Confucian traditions would become central to Chinese political and educational life, though the path from Confucius himself to imperial orthodoxy was long and complex. Other traditions also developed. Taoist texts explored naturalness, non-forcing, spontaneity, and the limits of rigid human schemes. Legalist thinkers emphasized law, state power, discipline, punishment, reward, and centralized authority. Mohist thinkers argued for impartial concern, practical benefit, and opposition to wasteful warfare. The warring states' world was not quiet. It was dangerous and competitive. But because states competed so intensely, rulers listened to advisors, strategists, engineers, administrators, and philosophers who promised stronger armies, richer farms, clearer laws, and more durable order. By the time the First Empire appeared, ancient China already contained many of the forces that would shape its future. Ritual bronze, ancestor reverence, fortified cities, writing, warfare, philosophical debate, bureaucratic reform, agricultural labor, regional diversity, and the dream of order under heaven. The empire did not arise from emptiness. It grew from a long preparation of power, thought, craft, and memory. It is also important to remember that early China was not only a story of kings. The villages, fields, and workshops beneath elite culture mattered just as much. Farmers cleared land, stored grain, raised animals, repaired tools, and endured the uncertainty of weather. Potters shaped vessels for ordinary use as well as ritual display. Jade workers and bronze casters depended on knowledge passed through practice, not only through writing. The world of the early kings rested on these layers of labor. Without harvests, there could be no court. Without could be no ritual bronze. Without families and villages, there could be no ancestors to honor. This makes early Chinese civilization feel less like a sudden invention and more like a long accumulation. A symbol that later seemed imperial could begin as a local sign. A ritual that later looked official could grow from older family practices. A wall that later served a state could begin as the defense of one settlement. The great structures of later China were built from smaller habits of order: storing, measuring, remembering, honoring, defending, and repeating. Qin Empire and the First Emperor. The first imperial unification of China came through the state of Qin. In 221 BCE, the Qin ruler conquered the last rival states and declared himself Qin Shi Huangdi, often translated as the first emperor of Qin. His rule marked a turning point. Earlier kings had claimed authority over states and regions. The first emperor claimed something larger: a unified empire governed by centralized command, standardized systems, and imperial law. The Qin achievement was enormous, but it was also severe. Qin power had been built through military reform, administrative discipline, agricultural organization, and legalist ideas about law and state control. The Qin state rewarded military merit, weakened hereditary aristocratic privilege, organized households for taxation and service, and used clear systems of punishment and reward. Its rulers and ministers cared less about moral persuasion than about obedience, production, registration, and measurable power. After unification, the Qin government worked to standardize the empire. It standardized weights and measures, currency, axle widths, and forms of writing used in administration. It divided territory into commanderies and counties, governed by appointed officials, rather than leaving the empire as a loose collection of hereditary feudal domains. Roads and canals supported movement of troops, supplies, officials, and messages. Laws and records helped bind distant regions to the central government. This kind of state power may sound dry compared with legends of dragons and warriors, but it was one of the most important inventions of empire. The Qin project was not only conquest, it was the creation of a machine of rule. If a tax weight meant one thing in one region and another elsewhere, the state was weaker. If local nobles could ignore central commands, the state was weaker. If writing was too varied for officials to communicate across provinces, the state was weaker. Standardization turned conquest into administration. The Qin also reshaped the human landscape. Families could be registered. Labor could be demanded. Soldiers could be moved. Punishments could be imposed. Men and materials could be sent across great distances for roads, walls, palaces, and tombs. To later admirers, this looked like terrifying efficiency. To many who lived under it, it may have felt like pressure without escape. The same system that built empire could grind ordinary people beneath its demands. The first emperor was associated with massive construction. Earlier northern walls built by separate states were connected, extended, or reorganized under Qin authority as part of defense against northern nomadic groups. This was not the stone and brick Great Wall familiar from many later images. Much of the Qin frontier system used packed earth, local materials, and earlier fortifications. The Great Wall, as most people picture it today, belongs largely to later periods, especially the Ming Dynasty. But the Qin helped create the imperial idea of a defended northern frontier marked by walls, watchtowers, roads, garrisons, and state labor. The emperor also sought control over memory. Later accounts describe the burning of certain books and the persecution of scholars, though the exact details and scale are debated by historians. The broader point is clear enough. The Qin regime feared intellectual and political fragmentation. Competing traditions, old aristocratic memories, and regional histories could undermine a new centralized order. Controlling texts, laws, measures, and officials was part of controlling the empire. The Emperor's Tomb complex near modern Xi'an became one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in the world. The Terracotta Army, discovered in the 20th century, consists of thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, along with horses, chariots, officials, entertainers, and other figures connected to the burial world of the first emperor. These figures were not all identical. Many show variation in hairstyle, armor, rank, facial features, and posture. They suggest a vast afterlife army guarding imperial power beyond death. The Terracotta Army is powerful because it makes Qin authority visible. A viewer sees not just one ruler, but an entire system: infantry, archers, officers, cavalry, chariots, discipline, hierarchy, and imperial command, frozen in clay. The army also reminds us that early empire required immense labor. Workers had to mine and prepare materials, model bodies, fire clay, assemble parts, paint surfaces, arrange formations, and build underground spaces. The glory of empire was inseparable from the burden placed on human hands. Qin Shi Huangdi sought permanence, but the Qin dynasty itself did not last long. After the first emperor died in 210 BCE, political struggle, harsh rule, heavy labor demands, and rebellion helped bring the dynasty down. By 206 BCE, Qin power had collapsed. Its imperial structure, however, did not vanish. The Han dynasty inherited and modified many Qin foundations. In that sense, the Qin failed quickly as a ruling house, but succeeded deeply as a model of empire. The Han dynasty, founded by Liu Bang, ruled for centuries with a break between the Western Han and Eastern Han periods. Han government softened some Qin severity, but kept the idea of a unified imperial state. Over time, Confucian learning became increasingly important in official ideology, especially under Emperor Wu. The Han expanded territory, fought and negotiated with steppe powers such as the Xiongnu, developed systems of taxation and labor service, supported state monopolies at different times, and deepened the connection between government, writing, education, and social order. Han China was not peaceful in any simple sense. It was a world of court factions, Frontier campaigns, peasant labor, taxation, conscription, palace intrigue, ritual performance, scholarship, and expansion. But it became one of the great defining periods of Chinese civilization. The name Han later became deeply associated with Chinese cultural identity. Even today, the largest ethnic group in China is known as Han Chinese, though modern identity cannot simply be projected backward onto ancient society. The Han also connected China more intensely to Inner Asia and beyond. Diplomatic missions, military campaigns, and trade networks linked the empire to Central Asia. Chinese silk became famous far outside China, though the phrase Silk Road is modern and can make the network sound more unified and orderly than they were. In reality, exchange moved through many routes, many intermediaries, many landscapes, and many political powers. Silk, horses, jade, metals, glass, ideas, technologies, religions, and people moved in complicated ways across Eurasia. Empire changed the scale of Chinese history. A village farmer might never see the emperor, but the emperor's world could still reach him through taxes, corvée labor, law, military service, coinage, roads, officials, rituals, calendars, and records. The imperial court might be distant, but its demands could be immediate. The empire was not only palaces and banners. It was grain collected, families registered, roads maintained, walls repaired, sons conscripted, texts copied, and fields measured. The Qin and Han did not create all of Chinese civilization, but they changed its political architecture. They made the unified empire a central ideal. Later dynasties would rise and fall, sometimes ruling all of China, sometimes only parts of it. Periods of unity alternated with periods of division. Non-Han peoples founded major dynasties. Frontier cultures influenced the center. The empire was never static, but the dream of order under a sun of heaven, supported by bureaucracy, ritual, law, writing, and cosmic legitimacy, became one of the enduring patterns of Chinese history. The first emperor's search for permanence also entered legend through stories of immortality. Later accounts describe his interest in elixirs, sacred mountains, and the possibility of escaping death. Whether every detail is reliable or not, the theme fits the larger Qin imagination. A ruler who unified the visible world also wanted to defeat the final boundary of human life. His tomb, guarded by clay armies and surrounded by an immense burial landscape, shows the same impulse in material form. If death could not be avoided, it could be organized like an empire. The Han response to Qin was not a rejection of empire itself. It was a recalibration. Han rulers learned that a state could not survive on severity alone. Ritual, learning, compromise with local elites, imperial ideology, and practical administration all had to work together. This became one of the enduring lessons of Chinese statecraft. Coercion could build power quickly, but legitimacy had to be cultivated if power was going to last. The Great Wall, Frontier War, and the legend of Mulan. The Great Wall is one of the most powerful symbols of China, but it is often misunderstood. It was not one single wall built at one time by one emperor. It was a changing system of walls, tamped earth ramparts, stone and brick fortifications, watchtowers, passes, beacon towers, roads, and garrisons built, rebuilt, abandoned, and reimagined across many dynasties. Different walls served different states and different frontier strategies. Some early walls belonged to warring states' kingdoms before imperial unification. Qin rulers connected and extended northern defenses. Han rulers built or maintained frontier lines in relation to steppe politics and trade routes. Later dynasties used different strategies. The most visually familiar parts of the wall, with stone battlements snaking across mountains, mostly reflect Ming dynasty construction after the ancient period. The famous symbol, therefore, compresses many centuries into one image. A wall is never only a wall. It is also a statement about fear, labor, geography, authority, and imagination. Frontier walls marked zones where settled agricultural states met mobile pastoral powers. But the frontier was not a simple line between civilization and chaos. It was a place of trade, diplomacy, raiding, intermarriage, tribute, migration, alliance, espionage, cultural exchange, and war. Farmers, soldiers, merchants, herders, interpreters, envoys, prisoners, and officials all belonged to this world. Northern frontier conflict was shaped partly by ecology. Steppe and semi-steppe societies often relied on horses, herding, mobility, and forms of political organization different from those of agrarian states. Chinese dynasties needed horses for war and transport. Steppe powers wanted grain, silk, metal goods, and prestige goods from the south. Sometimes relations were violent. Sometimes they were diplomatic. Sometimes imperial courts used gifts, marriage alliances, markets, hostage arrangements, titles, or military campaigns to manage the frontier. Signal fires and beacon towers are among the most cinematic images of this world. A warning could move across distance through smoke by day or fire by night. Riders could carry messages. Garrisons could prepare. Local commanders could respond before a threat reached deeper settlements. Such systems required maintenance, discipline, and trust. A beacon tower was not heroic by itself. It mattered because someone watched, someone stored fuel, someone understood the signal, someone had authority to act, and someone else might have to ride into danger. Frontier garrisons were also places of waiting. Soldiers repaired armor, counted arrows, watched weather, guarded passes, escorted envoys, and tried to survive boredom, cold, fear, and distance from home. Some men were professional soldiers. Some were conscripts or settlers. Some frontier communities blended farming and military obligation. Behind every grand image of a wall across mountains were ordinary problems. Food supply, horse fodder, winter clothing, command discipline, corruption, desertion, and the difficulty of moving orders across immense terrain. The frontier is also the setting that helps explain the later legend of Mulan. Mulan is not securely documented as a historical individual in the way an emperor or general might be. The earliest famous version is the Ballad of Mulan, usually associated with the northern and southern dynasties period, after the Han and before the Sui and Tang reunifications. In the poem, Mulan takes her father's place in the army, serves for years, refuses high office, and returns home. Her fellow soldiers are amazed when they discover she is a woman. The Mulan story is important not because it can be treated as a simple documentary record, but because it reveals themes that matter deeply: family duty, military service, gender expectations, loyalty, frontier war, disguise, honor, and return. Later retellings changed the story. Different eras shaped Mulan according to their own needs. She became a figure of filial devotion, martial courage, patriotism, theatrical drama, and modern cultural identity. For this episode, Mulan belongs to the world of memory and legend, not as proof that every detail happened exactly as later stories tell it, but as a way of seeing how frontier war entered cultural imagination. The empire needed soldiers. Families feared conscription. Fathers grew old. Sons were not always available. Women's labor, courage, and family duty were central to household survival, even when formal military systems were male-dominated. The legend takes these pressures and turns them into a story of one person crossing a boundary between home and war. A great wall watchtower at night and the figure of Mulan in memory belong to the same larger emotional landscape. Families listening for orders, soldiers watching the horizon, smoke rising from signal fires, horses moving through cold passes, armor repaired by lamplight, and the empire pressing its demands into private life. Frontier war was not only something emperors ordered. It entered households. It shaped songs. It became legend. The frontier also complicates the idea of China as closed or sealed. Walls can suggest isolation, but actual frontier history was full of movement. Goods crossed, envoys crossed, armies crossed, captives crossed, ideas crossed. Dynasties that ruled northern China were often deeply connected to steppe peoples. Some were founded by non-Han elites who adapted, or transformed Chinese institutions. Chinese history cannot be reduced to a simple story of one unchanging civilization defending itself from outsiders. It is also a story of contact, mixture, conflict, absorption, and reinvention. Even dragons fit into this world differently than fantasy might suggest. A dragon carved into imperial architecture was not a monster waiting beyond the wall. It was a symbol of power, reign, cosmic order, and imperial dignity. The real dangers of the frontier were human, political, and environmental. Hunger, cold, distance, cavalry raids, failed diplomacy, rebellious commanders, exhausted soldiers, overextended supply lines, and rulers who misunderstood the limits of force. The Great Wall became powerful partly because it seems to make history visible from far away. A wall across mountains looks like a civilization drawing itself onto the earth. But the real story is more human and more complicated. Men built walls in heat and cold. Officials counted supplies. Guards waited in towers. Farmers lived near garrisons. Merchants moved through passes. Nomads negotiated, raided, traded, and ruled. Legends grew in the shadow of these frontiers. So when we imagine ancient China through walls and warriors, we should not see only stone, drums, and banners. We should see systems, labor systems, warning systems, military systems, family systems, and storytelling systems. The wall was not merely a barrier. It was a machine of attention, pointed toward the horizon. The frontier also produced objects and sounds that belonged to everyday military life: drums, signal flags, horse bells, bow cases, leather armor, grain sacks, spare bowstrings, and sealed orders carried through wind and dust. It is easy to imagine the wall only from far away, as a line across mountains. But for the people stationed there, it was close and practical. It was the creak of a gate, the smell of smoke, the weight of a spear, the ache of cold hands, and the uncertainty of whether a signal on the horizon meant a drill, a raid, or a war. Mulan's legend survives partly because it brings that vast frontier pressure down to the size of one family. The empire may speak in commands, but households hear those commands as absence, fear, duty, and sacrifice. That is why the story remained adaptable for so long. It could be told as filial devotion, as martial courage, as gender disguise, as loyalty to a ruler, or as loyalty to a father. Its power lies in the fact that it connects imperial war to private love, inventions, fire, silk, and the machinery of civilization. Ancient and imperial China are often remembered for inventions, and rightly so. But invention should not be imagined as a series of isolated miracles created by lone geniuses in quiet rooms. Inventions grow from workshops, state needs, craft traditions, trade networks, military pressure, religious practice, record keeping, and ordinary problem solving. The technologies associated with China's long history were created across many periods, and not all of them belong to the earliest ancient dynasties. But together, they show how powerful the machinery of civilization could become. Silk is one of the oldest and most famous Chinese products. Sericulture, the raising of silkworms and production of silk thread, developed in ancient China and became deeply associated with elite clothing, tribute, diplomacy, trade, and cultural prestige. Silk required careful knowledge of mulberry trees, silkworm life cycles, cocoon handling, thread reeling, dyeing, weaving, and patterning. It was delicate, labor-intensive, and valuable. A silk banner or robe was not only beautiful, it represented organized agricultural and household labor, specialized skill, status, and long-distance desire. Silk also became a diplomatic and economic tool. It could be given as tribute, traded through intermediaries, used to reward allies, or sent beyond imperial borders. Its movement helped tie China to Central Asia and other regions, though the routes later called the Silk Road were never a single road controlled by one power. Silk moved because many people had reasons to carry, exchange, protect, tax, copy, and desire it. Paper was another transformative technology. Earlier writing in China used materials such as bamboo slips, wooden tablets, silk, and bones or shells in specific contexts. Paper developed gradually, and the Eastern Han official Kai Lun is traditionally associated with improvements in papermaking in 105 CE, though paper-like materials existed earlier. Paper made writing lighter, cheaper, and more flexible over time than many older materials. It supported administration, literature, education, religion, accounting, correspondence, and eventually printing. Printing developed later. Woodblock printing became important in China, especially by the Tang period and after, and movable type was developed in the Song period by Shang using ceramic type. Printing changed the scale at which texts could be reproduced. It supported Buddhist texts, calendars, official materials, literature, education, and the spread of knowledge. The world's earliest known dated printed book, the Diamond Sutra from 868 CE, comes from Tang, China. That is after the strict ancient period, but it belongs to the longer Chinese civilizational story that grew from ancient foundations. The compass also developed across time. Early Chinese lodestone and magnetic devices were connected first with divination and orientation, and later magnetic compasses became important for navigation. By the Song dynasty, the compass was used in maritime navigation. Like many inventions, it did not begin as one finished modern object. It passed through stages of observation, ritual use, practical adaptation, and wider application. Gunpowder is one of the most dramatic Chinese inventions. It emerged from experiments connected to Taoist alchemy, probably in the Tang period, as seekers of longevity worked with substances such as sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. The irony is striking. Experiments aimed at life and transformation helped produce a substance that would transform warfare. By the Song dynasty, gunpowder weapons included fire arrows, bombs, flamethrower-like devices, and other explosive or incendiary tools. True rockets and more advanced gunpowder weapons developed over time. For factual clarity, rockets and gunpowder warfare do not belong to the Shang, Zhou, Qin, or early Han world. They belong to later imperial China. But they are part of the reason China's historical legacy became so vast. The same civilization that produced bronze ritual vessels and oracle bone inscriptions, also across later centuries, developed technologies that changed war, navigation, communication, and knowledge far beyond East Asia. Invention did not erase suffering. A state that could print texts could also print regulations. A government that could measure land could tax it. A workshop that could make tools could make weapons. Fire arrows and rockets are visually exciting, but they belong to a history of siege warfare, military pressure, and human danger. The beauty of invention and the burden of power often lived together. Chinese administrative culture was itself a kind of technology. Registers, seals, calendars, measurements, examinations, archives, and legal codes helped states control time, land, labor, and status. During later imperial periods, the civil service examination system became a major institution, though its development was gradual and changed across dynasties. It linked education, classical texts, bureaucracy, family ambition, and social mobility, while also creating pressure, hierarchy, and exclusion. A brush, an inkstone, a seal, and a bamboo slip may seem less dramatic than a rocket, but they could be just as important. Empires survive through records. They tax what they can list. They command what they can name. They remember what they can copy. They recruit those who can read and write the authorized language of power. The written world was not separate from the imperial world. It was one of its bones. Chinese astronomy and calendar making also served government and ritual. Rulers were expected to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and human society. Calendars mattered for agriculture, ritual timing, legitimacy, and administration. Astronomical events could be interpreted politically. Observing the sky was not merely curiosity. It was connected to order. Artisans held knowledge that texts often only partly preserve. Bronze casters, silk weavers, potters, lacquer workers, carpenters, masons, armorers, printers, and military engineers made civilization tangible. Their hands produced the objects through which rulers ruled and families lived. Bells, vessels, roof tiles, armor, tools, paper, cloth, bricks, walls, and weapons. The empire that changed the world was not made only by emperors. It was made by skilled labor repeated across generations. The history of ceramics belongs here too. Chinese pottery traditions were ancient, and later Chinese porcelain became one of the most desired products in the world. Porcelain required refined materials, high firing temperatures, kiln control, glaze knowledge, and long craft development. Like silk, it became both an object and a signal. It carried beauty, trade value, technical mastery, and cultural prestige. This is why an invention section should not be imagined as a parade of objects on a table. It is better imagined as fire in a workshop, silk moving through a loom, paper drying in sheets, carved blocks pressed with ink, soldiers watching fire arrows arc against a night sky, kilns glowing in darkness, and officials carrying sealed documents through palace gates. Invention was movement, not display. It changed what states could command, what armies could do, what merchants could carry, what students could study, and what later worlds could inherit. Agricultural technology also belongs in this story, even if it is less spectacular than gunpowder. Iron tools, improved plows, irrigation works, seed selection, crop rotation in some settings, and local water control all shaped what states could become. A government can dream of empire, but it still depends on grain. More reliable agriculture meant more people, larger armies, more officials, more cities, and more tax. The quiet improvement of fields could matter as much as the invention of a weapon. Medicine, mathematics, music, and engineering also developed within long traditions of observation and practice. Chinese scholars and specialists recorded stars, calculated calendars, studied harmonics, classified plants and minerals, and developed medical theories that connected the body to broader patterns of balance and change. These systems were not modern science in a contemporary sense, but they were serious attempts to understand regularity, pattern, and consequence. They belonged to the same civilizational habit of ordering the world: dragons, dynasties, and the memory of an empire. Ancient China is often presented as if it were one unbroken empire, but that is too simple. Chinese history included unity and division, expansion and collapse, native and foreign rule, northern and southern courts, rebellion, reform, conquest, assimilation, migration, and recovery. The continuity is real, but it was not effortless. It was made and remade. Dynasties rose with claims of legitimacy and fell under the weight of court conflict, fiscal pressure, military defeat, rebellion, environmental strain, or loss of confidence. The mandate of heaven helped later historians and rulers explain these changes. If floods, famine, corruption, rebellion, and military disaster multiplied, people could interpret them as signs that a ruling house had lost heaven's favor. A new dynasty could then present itself not merely as a winner, but as the restorer of cosmic and moral order. This way of thinking made political change meaningful. It did not prevent violence. It did not guarantee good government, but it gave Chinese historical memory a powerful rhythm: order, decline, crisis, renewal. The rhythm could be comforting, terrifying, or politically useful, depending on who told the story. Dragons belonged to this symbolic world. The imperial dragon was not just decoration. It gathered ideas of rulership, heaven, auspicious power, cosmic order, reign, and majesty. Dragon imagery appeared in art, architecture, robes, ritual objects, and later imperial symbolism. But a dragon on a palace roof or robe did not mean ancient China was fantasy. It meant power was being expressed through a language of symbols that people understood. The same is true of palaces, walls, tombs, seals, bells, and banners. States create visible signs of authority. A seal turns a command into an official command. A palace gate separates the ruler's space from ordinary space. A bell or bronze vessel can make ritual audible and visible. A wall can make frontier anxiety into earth and stone. A tomb can make death imperial. Dragon can make sovereignty feel cosmic. But beneath these symbols were ordinary lives. Most people in ancient and imperial China were farmers. They planted, harvested, repaired tools, paid taxes, raised children, honored ancestors, survived droughts or floods, and lived under demands from households, landlords, local elites, and the state. The empire was not only what happened in capitals. It was also what happened in fields, villages, workshops, kitchens, shrines, and military households. Women's lives varied by period, class, region, and family circumstance. Elite women could influence politics through marriage alliances, court networks, motherhood, regency, and household management. Some women became powerful figures in imperial history, most famously Wu Zetian, who ruled as emperor during the Tang period after the ancient era. Many more women shaped family economies, textile production, ancestor rights, child rearing, and local social life in ways that rarely appear fully in official histories. Mulan's legend survives partly because it touches a pressure point between family duty and public war. China's memory also includes conquest by and interaction with non-Han peoples. The Xianbei, Khitan, Jurchen, Mongols, Manchus, and many other peoples played major roles in later Chinese and Inner Asian history. Some founded dynasties that ruled part or all of China. They adopted Chinese institutions, changed them, resisted them, and contributed their own military, cultural, and political traditions. Chinese civilization endured not because it was sealed off, but because it was repeatedly transformed. The Great Wall, therefore, should not be read as the whole story of China's relationship with the outside world. It is one symbol among many. There were also roads, embassies, marriages, markets, tribute systems, Buddhist pilgrimages, military colonies, frontier towns, translation projects, and trade routes. Buddhism entered China from India through Central Asia and became one of the major religious traditions of East Asia, changing art, philosophy, monastic life, printing, and ritual. That movement alone shows that China was not a closed world. Ancient China changed the world partly through objects and technologies: silk, paper, printing, gunpowder, compass knowledge, ceramics, ironworking techniques, and statecraft. But it also changed the world through models of government, historical writing, moral philosophy, family order, bureaucracy, literary culture, and artistic imagination. Its influence reached Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Central Asia, and beyond in different ways across different centuries. A historically honest story must hold scale and caution together. It is true that Chinese civilization is one of the longest continuous traditions in world history. It is also true that continuity was never simple sameness. It was maintained through rewriting, rebuilding, conquest, reform, memory, and debate. The China of the Shang was not the China of the Han. The China of the Tang was not the China of the Ming. The China of later global imagination is not identical to any one dynasty, but the echoes between them are real. That is why the title of this episode speaks of dynasties, dragons, and an empire that changed the world. The dynasties remind us that power rose and fell. The dragons remind us that symbols can outlive the courts that used them. The empire reminds us that administrative systems, walls, roads, rituals, laws, armies, workshops, inventions, and stories can shape history far beyond the lives of individual rulers. In the end, ancient China is not best understood as a single picture. Not only the Great Wall, not only the Terracotta Army, not only silk, not only dragons, not only emperors, not only inventions. It is a layered world of bronze and bone, field and palace, law and legend, frontier and court, ancestor and archive, signal fire and silk thread, rocket flame and quiet brushstroke. The empire changed the world because it taught later generations how large political order could become, how deeply writing could serve power, how symbols could hold memory, and how inventions born in one civilization could travel far beyond their first makers. It changed the world not in one moment, but through centuries of accumulated human effort. And that is why ancient China remains so powerful in memory. Its walls still cross mountains. Its soldiers still stand in clay. Its dragons still coil across roofs and robes. Its silk still suggests distance and desire. Its inventions still mark the history of knowledge. Its dynasties still rise and fall in the imagination like lanterns, appearing one by one through mist. A civilization does not need to be simple to be remembered. Sometimes it is remembered because it was never simple at all. Memory also survived through material landscapes. Ruined walls, tomb mounds, temple sites, old roads, ancestral halls, bronze inscriptions, carved stones, and later paintings allowed people to imagine themselves in relation to earlier ages. A dynasty could fall, but its symbols might be reused. A capital could be abandoned, but its plan might influence later builders. A poem could preserve a mood long after the army, court, or exile that produced it had vanished. This is why ancient China is so visually powerful for historical imagination. It offers mountains and walls, but also rooms of quiet writing. It offers armies of clay, but also silk threads and ink lines. It offers emperors and rebels, but also farmers, monks, mothers, merchants, craftsmen, frontier guards, and storytellers. Its history does not rest on one image. It survives because it can never be reduced to one image.